Alright, so this is one I kind of just wanted to do a while back, and it only just occurred to me after the fact that one of these movies is turning 30 this year, so it's appropriate anyway. And I think the reason I went after these was that there's obviously an array of movies here, and like this almost kind of subgenre of comedy in regards to the afterlife and the different portrayals that we've seen of it. And I think what I really, well, I know what I really love about these movies and that type, whether it be like these two or like, Heaven Can Wait or Here Comes Mr. Jordan or Cabin in the Sky or something like that, is the fact that, like pretty much everybody, even though not everybody may talk about it extensively, just in general, the crippling fear of death. Uh, and the fact that it just feels like it's getting closer every day can be really daunting. So when you have these movies that kind of have these sort of upbeat portrayals, I guess you could call it, there's like a really comforting thing about that. Where it's like, and obviously, you can have in your mind what you think is after. I know what I'm afraid it would be. Um, but like obviously the biggest fear would be nothing. So like I said, and but there's also that comfort in the fact that you won't know regardless whenever it does happen. But in the meantime, while that is this crippling fear that we all kind of live with, yeah, movies like this I just find some real like comfort in the way that they portray it. And all these different ways that we've seen it portrayed. And obviously these two take some approaches. Obviously, we don't really get too much of an after look as far as Heart and Souls goes. It's something that's just kind of always shrouded in mystery. And while Defending Your Life does kind of do the same thing, where we don't quite see what the beyond is, we do have Judgment City as this sort of waiting room. And like I said, stuff like this can just really add a sort of light tone to that whole thing. And in the small amount of time compared to life it takes you to watch the movie, you can almost feel good about it in a way. So I think I want to start with the movie that's having the 30th anniversary this year, which would be Defending Your Life, which is, like most of his movies, written and directed by Albert Brooks. And just like I'm just imagining. I was alive in '91, but if I were to have been the age to get hyped for movies in '91, I would have. I imagine there was a lot of build up behind Albert Brooks doing his own portrayal of what the afterlife might be like, and I would have been so excited for that. And going into this, what I do think is very interesting is that we don't really see in other movies like this is that obviously there's this adaptation period where he's being introduced to everything and being shown around and all that, but there's never really a moment, and it's almost what you would expect out of an Albert Brooks character, but there's never really a moment where he like has to come to terms with the fact that he is dead, or if like there's no scene where he's like confused about where he is. He's just here, and he's just dealing with it like immediately. Um, and the way that that's like the whole portrayal of it, and when he meets Rip Torn and they go through the whole stuff, and there's just like pleasantries about, but it's basically the same kind of pleasantries you'd have in like a business meeting. Stuff like his character prior to death knew too well. And so you get stuff like how there's no hell, but LA is getting really close to that. And in the way Brooks plays that scene in particular, in that line, when he has that way of like laughing and then just going right back into straight face, and it's like just watching him. It's crazy how subtle it is how he's dealing with being here, and there's not some really over the top freak out of, oh, I'm dead and I didn't get to accomplish this stuff and now all this stuff is gone or whatever. It's just like this is just the next thing, and like I said, you just deal with it, and that almost might be even more Albert Brooks than being neurotic about it, which is great. And obviously we get all these nice little touches. Of the world being explained, where it's like how children don't have to come here because children don't have to defend themselves. They can just go right into whatever's next. and how teenagers were here, but then they started damaging everything, like the tubas and stuff like that. So they just had to go somewhere else. Um, in just really the nonchalant way they do all of this. Like there's no big presentation to anything. Like the whole point is just how kind of dull it is. I mean, it's this amazing place where you know like it turns out there is an afterlife and you can eat whatever you want and you can interact with all these people, um, but there's still just the whole mundane quality to it. Like it's still the moment where he's like stuck on the tram with the old woman that won't stop talking, and it's like you almost expect a cut to where it's like because everything's so pleasant, he just doesn't mind listening. But then no, it's like he's going out of his mind. Still, as exactly as he would in real life, and the whole thing of how Judgment City is like so close to real life, but there's just all these amazing things kind of around it, that even then, if you were stuck here for too long, would start to get mundane. Um, unless of course you run into Meryl Streep. But before we get to that, I was talking about Rip Torn and how he is his defense attorney in this whole having to defend all the decisions he made in life to decide if he is either going forward or back to Earth in another form, to try and do it better. And then we also have a prosecutor, who is Lee Grant, Oscar winner Lee Grant, and what's really interesting about this setup, like not only is it just funny, like this is what Defending Your Life does so well, is it just keeps expanding on its creative ideas, but still being like every new development or like every new expansion we see on this world and how like, the rules of it work, are all as hilarious as they are creative. But what I really like about the whole setup of there being a defense attorney and a prosecutor is the fact that, like, not only is that just a really funny concept, but the fact that it's almost like Rip Torn kind of represents the way we sort of talk ourselves in or out of things, and how we, like, if we make a decision, we talk ourselves into it, thinking that it's a really good decision, whether it might not be or not. And then the prosecutor almost kind of represents the voice in the back of our head that's always like, like we know we could have done more. And so it's almost like the voices in your head, or like the angel and devil on your shoulder or something, ironically enough. But in this case, it's like, are we more? Does the prosecutor have more of a point in this whole idea of it not necessarily being completely 100% about, did you constantly do the right things or all this stuff, and were you just a good person in general? It's just more of a thing of, did you like live at all? Like, did you even make life worthwhile? Like, were you just kind of taking advantage of the idea of living and just like it's just leading a really mundane existence, like something that's no different than what's here. And it's almost like with Judgment City, it's trying to say like your life itself should be infinitely more interesting than what's in Judgment City, and it's despite all of the perks to it, I guess you could say. Um, and there's just and like I said, there's something like this where it's so, and Brooks has a great way of doing this in most of his movies, which is this idea of being like not only having really creative ideas, but having like really sort of deep themes to them, and like thought provoking things. But like I said, it never forgets to be funny, like so many comedies do. Right, comedies get so wrapped up in what they're doing a lot of the times that they'll forget that they're comedies, and then suddenly the writer or director wants to be, tell some really profound story or something, and it's like, but Brooks never forgets to be funny while he's doing all of this, and he succeeds all the way through in all aspects. Um, and in some of these scenes, the way they play out, we get a really, really young Ethan Embry in there as the kid that he makes the sacrifice for with the paints. I do have to say that one of my favorite scenes in any comedy ever is the little brief montage of his past misjudgments. It's a scene that I always come back to. It was like the first time I ever saw the movie forever ago. That was the scene that like really stuck out and the one I always remembered. Um, Before I became old enough to really appreciate just how much this movie's doing. But but I was to a kid, the misjudgment scene is the funniest thing ever, and I was so pleased to find out as an adult it still is. um, but going into the Streep stuff, what's really interesting about this is that this is a really great and charming role for Streep, and they have like incredible chemistry. Like it's instantaneous in a way that might be questionable on like a story front, but they just work so well together. It just you just go along with it, and how they have those differences of she was basically living this perfect existence. Like she's basically some hero out of a movie, is what her whole life was, while his was just so mundane. But yet the way they just sort of connect immediately, despite those completely different backgrounds, which makes the ending even greater. But what's interesting about that is I think because you can almost sense like an abruptness to it, and how the scenes, when they're judging him are so good that the Streep scenes might be seen as like the weaker aspect of the movie, and which is really interesting because the scenes themselves are not weak at all. It's just the rest of the movie is so funny and so interesting with all of its different ideas. It almost seems like a love story is almost too mundane. Um, but like I said, with the way they're clashing as regards to, they should be clashing in regards to where they come from, their chemistry just somehow just brings just as much life to it, and you can really get that sense of this is the first thing in his life that's really actually made him feel like he's actually living, despite the fact that it's something that could have happened in his regular life. And it's so yeah. So I still think that those are the weaker scenes. But like I said, that only is the fact that everything else works so well, and is so intriguing and so funny. Um, and also the idea of it where how this whole thing about trying to debate with yourself about what's on the other side, if anything. And it's like if I was saying, like, obviously the biggest fear would be nothing, um, but and then it also explores the past lives, which is something I've always like kind of hoped to believe in also, where it feels like it would make somewhat sense if you're just gone and then you're just another person with no recollection, and then the way we see who they were in their past lives, is not only a really funny concept, but the way the scene plays out, the Shirley MacLaine cameo. um, but going on that is all these ways that you can sort of speculate what might be, how if there's one thing that may be equally worse than there being nothing is what we come to find in Judgment City, which is everything is run by people in suits. Like I said, all these things where it seems like Judgment City is this on this whole other plateau of existence, and it's like they don't even do like cloud imagery or anything like that. Like this is just another somewhere else place, and still everything is being run and everything's being decided by just douchebags and suits. Another thing that feels like a very Albert Brooks way to portray something this otherworldly. And yeah, the fact that it all just comes back around to that whole thing of it's as far as learning from your past lives and whether or not you go back to Earth or you can go somewhere else. That whole idea of just living your life, not just living, but like living your life, and that whole like they put a lot of emphasis on becoming smarter, which becomes a kind of a running thing, and the fact that everybody else is kind of the little brains and people like Rip Torn and the whole percentage of brain usage and stuff like that, which is really funny. But yeah, when it comes down to it, it does feel like it has, and it might seem like this sort of vague sort of broad stroke theme of just doing that, but once again it's the way it portrays it and how you can actually see and feel something deep within the movie. But like I said, I have to keep saying this because it's the most important thing. The most important thing is the fact that it remains funny. Which, like I said, so many comedies lose their way with that, especially now. So to go back to this, and like I said, you can go back to so many other Brooks movies like Modern Romance and Lost in America and stuff like that. Stuff that seems sort of basic on the surface, but when you see how he can really delve deep into these themes and these characters and bring this really real feeling to it. Like it's interesting how much you can feel and can carry over from the real life and the real world. Real life, another one of his movies. Watching something like this that takes place in a place like this, but you can still feel that humanity that he puts in all his movies. So um, that I think is what is really all of those things. I think is what has really helped this movie go a really long way, and it's just as maybe even more beloved now than it was 30 years ago. So that's pretty much how I feel about that. Um, like I said, Heart and Souls is a different kind of movie. Still kind of taking that afterlife approach and just giving you this sense, like this sort of comfort that, you know, there could be something. But apart from that, the whole theme also, where once again, like defending your life, it's an idea that seems maybe a bit cliche and like it's a sort of broad stroke kind of thing. But the whole idea of like the unfinished business aspect of life. But like I said, it's really the way these movies approach what they do and what their ideas are and their characters that really bring it to life and bring those ideas to life. And if you can relate in that way and get invested in that way, then these ideas that seem cliche on the surface can really, their meaning can really get in you, and then in this really big way. So it is interesting that Ron Underwood did this movie, who did City Slickers, because we're going to be talking about him and his other really famous movie in a little bit, a few videos down the road. And it is where defending your life is like very clever and has a lot of really big ideas. Heart and Souls could almost seem smaller by comparison, not just in like themes or what it's doing, but it could almost be dismissed as maybe being a bit like cutesy, like maybe too cutesy for its own good. But a lot of people seem to have really taken to it over the years, and I especially love that. I believe I read somewhere that Downey himself has said that it's one of his favorite movies that he's in, which I just really love. And it's another one where it kind of sets up the rules of this movie, where defending your life kind of throws us immediately into it, like I said, to the point that we're not even like going through the whole thing of, oh my god, am I dead and how did I get here and stuff like that. No questions like that. It just is instantaneous. Heart and Souls is like a solid half hour of building up what's going on before we cut to the present day when Downey is an adult. Because we start with Downey being Eric Lloyd from He Was Charlie and the Santa Claus. And the, you know, critically beloved Dunstan checks in if you're a fan of that. But, yeah, so to introduce them at the same time, where we have all the different characters with Charles Grodin, Alfred Woodard, Kara Sedgwick, and Tom Sizemore, all as these lives that are kind of colliding, quite literally, as this child is being born that's ultimately going to grow into Downey, and he's going to have this... They're going to be attached to him seemingly forever. Certainly throughout his childhood, where they become friends, and it's almost like you get the sense that there's a story in here about like loneliness and alienation that's never quite delved into, where these four that he can see become his best friends, and they seem to be the only people he knows and his only friends, because the idea of him interacting with them, especially in public, is certainly isolating, and people actually think that he has mental issues because of this. And it's like there's a whole other movie in here with him as a kid that's almost might be too close to like Drop Dead Fred or something. But this has a lot more to say and a lot more emotion and a lot more just in general to take from it than something like Drop Dead Fred. It rises above that. Yeah, so there is a solid half hour here where they're building up like the rules, like how Sizemore's always trying to get away, and there's like an invisible wall there, and they're all so grouped together that if the group starts to stray away and there's one person, they'll be physically dragged back to the group. And like I said, they established this for quite a long time, to the point that him as a kid could almost be its own movie. And another thing that's interesting about this, that's really great about the characters is not only does this first half hour of the movie feel like it could be an entire movie, but if it was just like one of the ghost characters, whereas like if it was a movie with just the kid and Charles Grodin's character, or just him, and etc., all the others, um, those seem like they could work just as well. Where like he grows up with them, and then there's a point in time where he has to, one of them has to go away for one reason or another. Like he has to for what appears to be his own health, or they have to because they have finally moved on or whatever. And I feel like each of these four I could imagine being their own movie with this. Up to and including the idea of him eventually growing up, and like one half of it being when he's a kid and one half when he's an adult. Either way, I feel like there's so many different ways this movie would have worked, and the fact that it works as is as well, just kind of speaks to the richness of what's here through character and not necessarily just story. Because like I said, the story is pretty the kind of thing that you've heard before. The whole thing of ghosts having unfinished business and having to do this one thing from their life, and then they can go on. But it takes a while for us to get to that for a comedic reason, because David Paymer doesn't do his job. As in the fact that David Paymer was not doing his job well is why they're in this predicament in the first place, which is a whole funny concept in itself. Especially with David Paymer playing a character like this is like perfect casting. Everybody in this is really perfectly cast. Like even knowing how much of like a fucking creep Tom Sizemore is in real life, you still like really grow to love Milo as much as Thomas does, which is which speaks to whether his talent, I guess, and the fact that he and Downey would reunite on the next year for Natural Born Killers of all things. It's but anyway, going into everything else, the way all these interactions happen, where it is like even though they would work individually, the fact that they're an ensemble is even more appealing. Because not only do we have all these great actors, but these whole even when he can't see them yet, when he hasn't found them again, I guess you could say. There's this whole thing where it's almost like when you see like the overlapping dialogue and stuff like Robert Altman movies, is actually used quite well here, because oftentimes the ghosts are so chaotic amongst themselves that there's just constant overlapping voices, and I love the moments especially when they're following Thomas around when he can't see them yet, and the camera will just be focused on him, and you can hear their overlapping voices off screen, and it almost gives this vibe of like voices in your head. But there's still the comedic image of they just have to constantly be around him because it's just physically that way. They are physically stuck to him, basically. And eventually, once he does see them, it does get a bit slapstick heavy, which is actually quite funny because this is fresh off Downey playing Chaplin. And there's that particular moment when he has to make the escape on the roof, when Sizemore's in his body, and he has to do what we saw in the earlier scene, but there's no house to jump off of now, or jump onto now, so he's got to do this whole bit, and it's funny that he played Chaplin, because this house scene and the way Downey has to play it almost gives vibes of like Harold Lloyd or Buster Keaton or something. Like in this sort of classic slapstick vibe, which is real great, and it gives kind of the movie itself this whole sort of classic feel, and I think the fact that the ghosts come from a different era kind of already sets that up anyway. So while they come from like the 50s, and we're talking like 20s and 30s style of comedy, and then we're in a movie that's in the 90s, it all kind of wraps up all these different eras so well, interestingly enough. And then, of course, Downey gets to play to his comedic talents very well, given basically this silver platter of opportunities as far as comedies go, where eventually all of the ghosts will end up in his body at one point or another. So at one point, he'll have to play Sizemore, then he'll have to play Water, then he'll have to play Grodin, and I can't remember if Sedgwick ever ends up in his body or not. I'm thinking the boardroom scene, of course, the first big one, and the thing here is that first off, everybody kind of went crazy about Tropic Thunder, and it's like it's kind of funny when you look back to Heart and Souls, and it's like technically Tropic Thunder was not the first time Downey played a black person. So when Alfred Woodard is in his body, um, and that's something that could be, looked back on and people might question, but I think it's still, there's just something so lighthearted about this movie and how it doesn't have, like, a bad bone in its body or a hateful bone in its body. Um, and the way he has to, like, almost subtly portray all four characters at one point or another. Particularly when Grodin has to take over and the national anthem scene happens. And, like I said, how all these scenes where they're doing the one thing, it's one thing that it's an obvious objective, like having to do the unfinished business and then you can move on. But how each individual scene works so well and feels like climatic in its own way, where like every time one of them goes, it doesn't feel like it's, oh, we're just abruptly losing one after the other. It's like every character gets a big send off. It's especially poignant with watching Grodin go off on the bus now that we've just lost him quite recently. So there's a whole other layer to that, and then of course the scene where they gradually realize that the sergeant is Billy, Alfred Woodard's son, and and these are scenes that could be like really cheesy, but there's just such a real sincerity in the movie that like I don't really feel like there's some sort of false, or there's not one moment that makes me say like that this is a little too sentimental or something like that. And while it's by definition sentimental, that don't, like, every time you hear sentimental in like talking about movies, it always seems to be a negative, which is concerning. Quite honestly, it's like, is that just how cynical we are now, where sentimental can't be a compliment? Because when it really hits emotionally and that works, there's really hardly anything like that feeling when a movie can get that out of you. And it's like we should hope that they sort of strive for that. And obviously, there are movies that lay it on thick, and it does end up really cheesy and not quite. And it might feel fake because of that. Like I said, the sincerity in this movie goes such a long way. And like I was saying, I think it's also just the way the friendship angle comes into it. Where, like I said, how it doesn't really delve into how lonely of a kid he must have been, but it's like I feel like it's deliberate that we like barely ever see his parents. We see his parents like once or twice throughout the whole movie, and they're like referenced once, and that's pretty much it. And the rest is just him with them. And the way they bring in another angle is probably the weak aspect of the movie, much like Defending Your Life, whereas the street scenes are great in themselves, I'm just not as invested in them as I am the rest of the movie. It's the Elizabeth Shue scenes are a bit forced, I think, and how they could have made her. I think this could have gone a long way if they had made her a more likable character. I think, where it's like it's really just like she just kind of constantly has problems. Like I think one scene that really makes this stick out is the national anthem scene, where it's like every time I watch the movie, I get so frustrated that she doesn't get excited. And she doesn't look at her parents and say, like, that's him, that's the guy. And it's like, how great would that have been? And, like, that's, like, his introduction to her parents, and it's a whole thing. And it's like, that should be a great scene. But it's just, like, they just keep forcing the conflict, and it almost feels... And it sucks that feels unearned, because such a big part of the climax, the Kira Sedgwick story, is so tragic until it comes back around to that. Where it's like, her poor boyfriend who got his heart broken, Sean O'Brien plays him. I can't remember the character's name. That's how just pushed to the side he is. I can't remember his name, but it's the whole thing where we get that whole build up, and he just apparently went off and died alone, and you think that's going to be the ending, but then it's like, oh no, my purpose was to get you with Elizabeth Shue. That's great and everything, but it feels like it should be an equal measure big moment for him and Elizabeth Shue and for Sedgwick, but it feels like strictly like, oh, this is great for Sedgwick, but then, okay, he's with Elizabeth Shue, I guess. And it's almost like an afterthought. So that is a place where I feel like it kind of, like, that's probably the only thing about the movie that doesn't quite ring true to me is the Elizabeth Shue stuff, which sucks because Elizabeth Shue could have easily pulled off a character that was a lot more likable. But as it is, here we go, because we need conflict, I guess. Because there's not enough conflict that four of these ghosts need to find their way to the other side, but, whatever. But that's basically what Heart and Souls is, and this is where it gets tough as far as, like, putting a gun to my head and telling me to pick one of these, is that even though Defending Your Life does everything right, and even does more right than Heart and Souls, specifically comparing the shoe scenes and the street scenes, um, there's something about Heart and Souls, and maybe it's the sentimentality or something like that, but Heart and Souls is the one that I feel some sort of connection to. Like, I can watch Defending Your Life and be like, this is really funny, this is really clever, this has such great ideas, Brooks is brilliant, and I really like the street love story, and I really love their chemistry, but I just feel like an emotional investment in Heart and Souls that I don't like. It's almost like my relationship with Defending Your Life is more technical. And Heart and Souls, despite its couple of problems, is a movie that just makes me feel that certain way. That you really, like I said, that sentimental way that is not always a bad thing, regardless of what critics will try to tell you. If I were to, like, want to watch one of these and I was trying to debate, more often than not, I'd probably end up choosing Heart and Souls for that reason. Even if you could probably say Defending Your Life is objectively better as far as writing and ideas and stuff like that. But like I said, there's something about the characters and the way those individual scenes happen, the emotional scenes play out, that just always draws me to Heart and Souls and probably always will. So that would be the direction I would go. But yeah, so I think that's going to be it for this. So the next thing is going to be either we're going to go into the Robert Rodriguez movies or there's a review or something. There's a lot of stuff going on, and I'm filming them out of order now, so I'll get we'll get back on track. Until whatever's next, I think that's it.